preach Psalm 119 now. That was good. If you have your Bibles, we're going to start out in Deuteronomy chapter 16. We're in the middle of a series, and you guys in the traditional service, you're kind of getting a back and forth, right? I think you probably did John 9 last week, and we're going to kind of hang out in John 8. But before we can really find out what's going on in John 8, we're going to have to find out what's going on in John 7. And then to know what's going on in John 7, we have to know what's going on in Deuteronomy. All right, so that's where we're kicking it off. Deuteronomy chapter 16, starting verse 13. Celebrate the festival of tabernacle for 7 days after you have gathered the produce of your threshing floor and your winepress. Be joyful at your festival, you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, and the Levites, the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns. For 7 days celebrate the festival to the Lord your God at the place the Lord will choose, for the Lord your God will bless you in all your harvest and in all the work of your hands, and your joy will be complete. And so the festival of the tabernacle is the setting for John 7 and 8, where we're going to be reading here in a little bit. And so it's this, there's three festivals, main festivals in the Jewish tradition, and what would happen is they would travel, like they were saying, they would travel into Jerusalem to make their offerings and celebrate, right? And so there's a very old book, it's called the Talmud, the Mishnah, all right? And the Mishnah is kind of the written down oral traditions of the Jewish religion. And so they actually speak about this celebration, this Festival of Tabernacles, and it says this. They say, they don't say Festival of Tabernacles, they say Beth Hashubah, all right, Beth Hashubah. So it says this. This is from the Talmud. Sorry, the Mishnah. I don't know why I keep mixing those up. They said, anyone who has not seen the rejoicing of Beth Hashubah in his life has never seen rejoicing. At the end of the first festival day of the festival, the priest and the Levites went down to the women's courtyard, and they made a major enactment by putting men below and women above, and there were golden, this is the important part, catch this, there were golden candle holders there with 4 gold bowls on their tops and 4 ladders for each candlestick, and 4 young priests with jars of oil containing 120 logs would climb up the ladders and pour the oil into each bowl. Out of the worn-out undergarments and girdles of the priests, they made wicks, and with them they lit the candlesticks, and there was not a courtyard in Jerusalem which is not lit up from the light of Beth Hashubah. And so these lights, they would light them up. And it would, like I said, it would light up this whole thing, and this is this huge celebration. And so what the lights represented, they were these towering candles. What they represented was all the way back into Exodus. And so when the Israelites were leaving Egypt, right, they crossed the Red Sea, and it says they followed a pillar of smoke. You remember this? The pillar of smoke by day and a pillar of fire by night. And so the fire, right, is kind of representing that pillar that guided the Israelites through the wilderness. And so this is the setting then that Jesus is now teaching. He was teaching all the way through John chapter 7 and all the way into John chapter 8 at this festival with these lights probably going. And so this is where a famous passage, and listen, I'd never heard this passage in this context. Like I just learned about this 2 weeks ago. And this is where he says, John 8, you'll know this scripture, verse 12. Do you have that? Maybe not. John 8, verse 12, it says, again, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And so, like, again, I've read this passage over and over again, for the last 15 years or so, but I never understood kind of this idea of the light behind him, what he was really claiming to be. It's like, sometimes you read that and you're like, the light of the world, and it's like, okay, like goodness and kindness and, that kind of thing. It's like, that's not really what he's saying. When he's saying, I am the light of the world, in this context, what Jesus is saying is like, I am the pillar of light. I am the pillar of fire. I am the pillar of smoke that guided Israel through the wilderness. That's me. I am the light of the world. And so I love that Psalm 119. So remember John 1, right? So in John 1, John writes, the Word, in the beginning was the Word, right? And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then I think verse 14 says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, right? And so when David, in Psalm 119, this is so cool. So he's talking about the law when he says, thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. The Word, like he has no idea, the Word, right? John tells us, we as Christians, we get to look at the New Testament in light of the Old Testament, or the Old Testament in light of the New Testament. And so when we look at thy word as a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path, David's talking about the law, but as Christians, we get to go, Jesus is a lamp unto my feet, and Jesus is a light unto my path, because he is the Word, right? He's the perfect Word. And so it is him who lights the path that we should follow. And this is where I would always get this wrong. I'd get this wrong so often, because I would think, if Jesus is my lamp, that I'm the one holding it, or I'm the one that's kind of pointing it in the direction that I want to go, going, God, light my path, right? Light my path. It's like that's not what we're talking about at all, right? He's going, no, I'm lighting the path, you walk in it, right? He tells us where to go. He tells us what to do. He's the one that gives us his will. And so we follow where he's guiding us. Well, what does that look like? And that's kind of broad. It could be. But in this passage, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, because if you looked at it beforehand, it's long, right? I think there's like almost 60 verses in John chapter 8, so we'd be here all day, and then we'd get nothing done, okay? But earlier in the day, so you have to kind of go back, because what's happening is it's a dialogue between the Pharisees and Jesus, right? And so there is this constant back and forth, and you're going to see it all the way through John as we get to the cross, a back and forth of the Pharisees and Jesus. And they're going after him, they're trying to trap him, they're doing this. And so if you go to John 7, verse 25, says this, at that point, so this is the same day. I just want you to know, John 7 is the same day as John 8, right? So this is all happening at the same time. At that point, some of the people of Jerusalem began to ask, isn't this the man they are trying to kill? Here he is, speaking publicly, and they are not saying a word to him. Have the authorities really concluded that he is the Messiah? And that's kind of the crux of the situation. It's like that people are beginning to follow Jesus in mass crowds, right? They're everywhere he's going. They know he's coming, right? They're hearing about Jesus, what he's doing, all the healing, all these things. So it's like, I want to be around Jesus. And they're just following him everywhere. And what happens, those people that are following Jesus used to follow the Pharisees. So as a Pharisee, you don't want to see that, right? You don't want to give up. You don't want to give up control. You don't want to give up power. You got power when you're in kind of the seat of God, so to speak, as the teachers of the law in that era. They're the ones supposed to guide and direct and teach and love. And they're going, no, power. I want power. And I mean, I think we're like that sometimes. When Jesus says, hey, this is where I'm calling you, and it's like, I don't want to give up my power. I don't want to give up some of my control. Because listen, there's times in my life, I do shared parenting with teenagers, okay? There's times that I want to do what I want to do and say what I want to say, right? but we have to, right? We trust, right? And we just believe that if we're doing what God's called us to do, and we're going to find out what God's calling us to in a little bit, but if we're doing what God's calling us to do, then we just have to breathe in it, right? We have to rest in it and let that anxiety, we get to put it on him because we're doing what he says, right? If I tell my kids to do something and they do it and it goes wrong, that's on me, right? So they have to trust me. And so when we do what God's calling us to do, we can push that anxiety right back to him and go, I'm doing what you call me to do, God. I need you to handle it, right? So that was extra. That had nothing to do, I think, with the passage. All right? So John 8. John 8. So they're trying to kill Jesus. And it says, this is what they say in verse 25. This is kind of that dialogue continued. Oh, there we go. Oh, you had it. John 8, verse 25. Who are you? They asked. And he says, just what I've been telling you from the beginning. Jesus replied, I have much to say in judgment of you. But he who sent me is trustworthy, and what I have heard from him I tell the world. And so the Pharisees, again, they've been left in charge. And so Jesus is going, I'm actually here for judgment for you, like for the Pharisees, right? Because they were given a role to lead the people of God and to teach them who God is. And then Jesus comes and goes, you haven't been doing it right. Right? I mean, you can go back, we don't have time, but you can go back into Jeremiah, and God's going, listen, you were supposed to shepherd my people, but I'm going to do it myself. I'll come down myself. And that's what Jesus is, right? He's God come down himself to be the shepherd. And it's like the people of the Pharisees were not shepherding the people. They were failing. And God says, I'm going to do it myself. And so Jesus shows up, God in the flesh. And he says this about them. In Matthew 23, it says this, then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, they sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide and their tassels on their garments long, and they love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplace and be called rabbi by others. So there are no harsher words in the New Testament than Jesus' words to the religious elite, to the people that were put in charge. He is the one that comes down and, listen, Jesus doesn't flip the tables on people that are seeking God, right? Everyone loves to talk about Jesus flipping tables. But what was happening, it was one of these events where people were supposed to come from all over and bring their offerings. And so occasionally, you would, if you had to bring an offering, you were far away, you didn't want to bring your animals with you, you could sell your animal at home, bring the money, take the money to the temple, and then you could rebuy there. And so it was an exchange system, right? It was just to save you some energy and make it easier for you to worship. And they show up, and it's the exchangers are going, no, you got to pay extra. You got to pay extra, right? We want to make money off God's worship. And so Jesus flips the tables. But it's not on the people seeking God. It's on the people that are keeping those from him, right? And so I just wonder, because I think we're doing a good job here, but I mean, nationwide, the American church, right? As I've grown up, I could always see the similarities between the church as perceived by the world and the Pharisees in the New Testament, right? That we are more often, the church is more often seen as that which puts a load on someone, that puts weight on others. That because it says what? It was like they tie up. This is what he said about the Pharisees. Does this sound good? Sound familiar? They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they won't lift a finger. And then Jesus goes, but I'm actually light. My yoke is easy, and my people are putting a hard yoke on you. And so he just speaks all this into these people. He's not making friends. All right? So let's go back to the passage here. John chapter 8, verse 31. So it says this, to the Jews who had believed him, Jesus said, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Right? We know this. They answered him, we are Abraham's descendants and have never been slaves of anyone. How can you say that we shall be set free? Jesus replied, very truly, I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now, a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. And so if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. I know that you are Abraham's descendants, yet you are looking for a way to kill me because you have no room for my word. So this is interesting. It says, if you hold to my teaching, you will be free. It seems good, right? I mean, I want to be free, right? But what does it mean? Like, what is Jesus' teaching? I'm glad you asked. I prepared for that. You have to go to John 15. You got to jump forward, and he makes it very clear. He tells us exactly what his teaching is. So in verse 9, it says, "As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands," right here it is, kind of. "If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete." Anybody want that? I want that. "My command is this," so here it is. "Love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." And so I think the question, and this is where the will of God, I think I grew up in a tradition that talked a lot about being in God's will. Like I grew up with it was like, make sure you're in youth group. It was like, make sure you're in God's will. And so it actually created a little bit of stress and anxiety sometimes to go, like, so do I have to, like, which school I go to, like what job or career, like, is this something that I got to find out what God's will is? And it's like, when you look at Scripture, the will of God, the command of God is to love people. And so even if you go to the Great Commission, right, it says, "Go into all the world and make disciples," right? Well, the word "go" there is actually better translated "as you go," right? So it's less concerned about where you're going or where you'll end up as much as what you're doing along the path, right? So you don't have to stress out about the daily decisions, but you ask the question, this is the question we should ask: what does love require of me? What does love require of me? And that's a great way to start looking for the light. When you're looking for the light, that's the question you ask. What does love require of me? And that love, that's where Jesus is. Wherever the love is, that's where Jesus is. And so we go towards that light, means we just go towards love. But there's a passage that I think everyone kind of knows, but it kind of ties into this. Mark 8 says, "Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, 'Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me.'" And I bring this up because there's something that God's calling us to carry, right? So we're not just out here free willy. There's something that we're called to, and it's like, so what does it mean? What does it mean to pick up your cross? Because that's what Jesus is doing every day, right? It's literally, as we walk through John, it is Jesus knowing where he's going. Jesus knows he's going to the cross, and so every day he wakes up and makes a decision that I'm not going to call down angels, I'm not going to raise up my own army, but I'm going to just walk towards my death. That's what he's doing every day, knowing he's going to the cross. And what does the cross mean? Well, it's the point of great tragedy. It's the greatest tragedy when you think of the most innocent person receiving the greatest punishment, right? That's tragic. It's a tragedy, right? We know what happens. We know the end of the story, right? So we can rejoice. But that's tragic. And so you pick up your cross. You pick up the weight of the world. You pick up your burden, right? Because life can be painful. Life will be painful. Like we've been there. If you haven't been there, you will be, right? We experience pain. But God calls us to take up that pain, right? To take up that pain and follow him. Take up your pain and follow him. Now, where is he going? He's going towards the cross. So are we supposed to go towards suffering? Yes. Yes, we go towards suffering because we're called to lift the burden, to lift the suffering. And so we take our suffering and we find other people's suffering. We go there, not so we can say, look at me suffering. We go there so we can lighten the load of others. So we can relieve the suffering of those in our community, those in our families, our friends. That's our call. Let's go to the end of the chapter. We'll get close to wrapping up. John 8, verse 48 says, "The Jews answered him, 'Aren't we right in saying that you are a Samaritan and demon-possessed?'" Now, I read this and I think, do they expect Jesus to just go, "You got me. You got me"? No, it's like some kind of rhetorical question, I guess. But he answers. He says, I am not possessed by a demon, said Jesus. But I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. I'm not seeking glory for myself, but there is one who seeks it, and he's the judge. And very truly, I tell you, whoever obeys my word will never see death. At this they exclaimed, now we know you're demon-possessed. Abraham died, and so did the prophets, yet you say that whoever obeys your word will never taste death? Are you greater than our father Abraham? He died, and so did the prophets. Who do you think you are? And Jesus replied, if I glorify myself, my glory means nothing. My Father, whom you claim is your God, is the one that glorifies me, though you do not know him. I know him. He's not making friends, right? I mean, this is to the people that are supposed to know God. Not only know God, but they're supposed to know the Messiah. They were supposed to be ready for Jesus, and they missed him. Though you do not know him, I know him. If I did not, I would be a liar like you. But I do know him and obey his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. And they said, you are not 50 years old, and you've seen Abraham. Very truly I tell you, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am. And at this they picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. And so the question, so why did they realized that they had a right to stone Jesus at that moment in their minds? Because even though they were under control of Rome allowed the Pharisees to handle some of their own legal matters. And if they did some things that were under their law, they were allowed to take care of it. And so Jesus said something that allowed them, under their rules, to try to kill him, to try and have him stoned. Well, what was it? Well, when he says, listen, John, again, begins by telling us that Jesus is God, that the Word became flesh and made its dwelling among us. And then all through the rest of the book of John, it's as if he's kind of peeking, constantly letting us peek into the closet and see how Jesus is revealing himself to the world. And that's why in John uses the word signs instead of miracles. Right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke use the term miracles, but John says, no, it's signs, because he's pointing to something. He's trying to show us something. And so the I am statement, because if you remember when 2,000 years, like Abraham, they're like Abraham's been dead for 2,000 years. And Jesus says, actually, he makes a reference to Exodus, when Moses was kind of hanging out, shepherding his flock. He was living with his wife and father-in-law, Jethro, and you remember he's out tending sheep, and there's a bush, right, that's on fire. And he's like, it's on fire, but it's just staying on fire. It's not burning up. And Moses goes to it, and actually God speaks to him. You remember this in verse 13? Exodus 3, it says, Moses said to God, because God had told him, I want you to go rescue my people, right? I want you to go save my people. And he says, okay, well, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. And so Jesus is making a claim. The same claim he made when he said, I'm the light of the world, that I'm the tower, I'm the pillar of light that was in the wilderness. He's making that same claim. He's saying, no, I was actually in the bush. I'm the one that came to you. I'm that one. I've been and always have been and always will be. And so you have to decide whether I think this is kind of a twist on C.S. Lewis, is like he's either liar, lunatic, legend, or Lord. Right? You got to pick one. I think C.S. Lewis, I don't think, had legend, but so is he a liar? I mean, they thought so, right? That's why they tried to kill him. Is he a legend? It doesn't seem like it. It seems like we have a great wealth of information from the New Testament documents and even extra biblical sources that even the most ardent atheists believe that Jesus was alive, that Jesus of Nazareth existed. So it's not a matter of whether he existed. So he's not legend. Is he a lunatic? Well, if you say I'm God, I might think you're a lunatic, right? If you said it. But he said it, and then he also said, I'm going to go die and then not stay that way, right? And anyone who can prophesy their own death and resurrection is one thing. Anyone can do that. Pulling it off, right? Pulling it off is what says, no, it's not legend, he's not a lunatic, he's not a liar. Like we know that he used to be dead and he's not anymore. And so, in verse 28, we're kind of just left with, he is Lord, right? And it says this, when you have lifted up, Jesus said this, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he. And so lifted up it's a double entendre here, right? So it's lifted up because when he's nailed to the cross, they lift the cross up, right? So he's lifted up and they drop it into that hole. But lifted up also means exalted, right? And so he is lifted. So in the same moment where he is lifted up in the most tragic moment in history, he is also glorified and exalted, and it goes and becomes Lord, and he is King. And so listen, the Bible says that when Jesus was hanging on the cross, that darkness came over all the land. How fitting that when you snuff out the light of the world, that darkness would ensue. Let's be the light, church. God bless.